Saludos, and thank you for joining us. I'm Melinda Gonzalez, the coordinator of the Puerto Rican Heritage Cultural Ambassador Program at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, City University of New York. The Cultural Ambassador Program is a free online course on Puerto Rican history and culture. The link to register for the Cultural Ambassador Program can be found in the chat section. This event will present 3 short films on the Puerto Rican contributions to the musical landscape. Our speaker, Elena Martinez, will provide commentary after each film. Elena Martinez is the co-artistic director of the Bronx Music Heritage Center and a folklorist at CityLore. Her work at CityLore has included getting Casa Amadeo, the longest continually run Latin music store in New York City, nominated to the National Register of Historic Places, the first nomination related to the Puerto Rican experience on the mainland. She also nominated Master Puerto Rican lace maker, the Art of Mundillo, Rosa Elena Egipciaco, for the NEA National Heritage Award. Her full bio, Elena's full bio, can be found on Centro's event page. And now we will present the first film on SEMILLA Cultural.
My name is Isha Maria Renta Lopez. I am the founder and director of a bomba group called SEMILLA Cultural. I never thought that I would be doing traditional dance ever. There's a special connection between the dancer and the main drummer, where the dancer will be improvising dance movements and the drummer simultaneously gotta try to play them in the drum.
I should be able to follow what she's doing and try to get her energy and try to transmit it back so that energy continues flowing.
Bomba is a traditional music and dance form developed by the enslaved Africans that lived in the island. And it requires a singer that will be with a chorus, and it'll be a call response type of singing. Traditionally, percussion instruments, drums, maracas, and a pair of sticks called kwa, and a dancer. So it kind of becomes a challenge, a dialogue between main drummer and dancer, and then there's other drummers that are keeping the basic rhythm going. In the fall of 2006, I joined Raíces de Borinquen, which was a folkloric dance group. And they would do bomba plena. And from there on, they had a very good, well-established group. Unfortunately, after 2010, it kind of started winding down. People started moving away. Some people decided not to keep going to rehearsals. You know, I don't consider myself an expert, but I think I knew enough that I could share what I knew. I had this knowledge, and I realized it didn't belong to me. I thought, well, maybe I could form my own group. What if I do like a pilot workshop in my basement? Let's see if it brings enough people, and from there, if there's enough interest to kind of like build up a group. And from there, it's been a great journey. I think the effort of a lot of the ambassadors in the island and outside of the island is paying off. In the last decade, when the bombazos started, people started learning about it. I think people started connecting more with their heritage and their identity.
Para mí la bomba es esa conexión con Puerto Rico. A pesar de que estoy lejos, me mantiene conectada con mi islita. Es esa comunicación entre la bailarina y el primo, representando toda la cultura bella que nosotros tenemos, y es ese ritmo, esa pasión que lleva la bomba en sí.
As a director of Semilla Cultural, you know, an ambassador of bomba in the area, it comes with a big responsibility of make sure that I give the right information. Cuando estén bailando, cuando estén tocando los cuales, las maracas, tocando los tambores, tienen que transmitir todo eso que sienten y todo lo que es la bomba es para ustedes. So, sin más preámbulos, vamos a seguir tocando. I will also make people feel welcome. You know, that just because I'm from a different culture, it doesn't mean that I'm gonna put a wall between us. On the other hand, no, I'm gonna open up everything that I know and share it with you. And at the same time, I'm open to learning from them. As part of the group, we do a lot of not only practice our songs, but we also do developmental and dynamics between the group to think about bomba not only as music and singing, but also, you know, how did you connect to it? Like we've done group dynamics like describe bomba in one word, or saying one word, why are you here? And, you know, that was a very interesting conversation because some people say, you know, it gives me power, or it makes me feel free, or it's a necessity in my life.
Okay, para mí, la bomba es pasión. Una conversación entre el primo y la bailadora. Una historia que se lleva a las masas en canción con entrega y mucho más.
Un momento donde yo dejo ir lo que yo llevo. Por eso es que yo me quedo y me voy y no estoy pendiente de lo que pasa por alrededor. Pues es un momento íntimo. Es mi momento donde somos todos, pero yo sigo siendo uno, ¿verdad? Y para mí, pues, a mí me cura.
I say it's a conversation because I feel that, you know, you're connecting with someone, but you're not using words. You're using your physique, and he's using his hands. You're telling a story while you're dancing. So, you know, as a viewer, I expect that you can feel that story, or you can see that story happening based on my mood or the emotions that I can transmit through the dance. Doing the right tones and playing the rhythms the right way will take a lot of dedication. You have to practice a lot, do rudiments, and, you know, also develop a muscle memory. Make sure you don't get tired, because you can be playing for hours or you can be playing for 15 minutes. So it takes a lot of dedication. So it's, you know, individually it depends, but I've seen people develop in months when other people years. So it depends. Semilla Cultural definitely has gotten a lot more attention than what I expected. It's a great feeling because I've get contacted by some people from Puerto Rico, you know, supporting us, letting us know that, you know, you guys are doing a great job. You know, you gotta do this, what you're doing is right. And I feel that, you know, what we are doing is the right thing, because it looks like we're filling a gap that was needed. I think all people think, you know, you mentioned they're from Puerto Rico and they think about arroz con gandules and they think about plátanos, and, you know, they think salsa. They don't think bomba en plena because they don't know it. So I think the fact that you're not doing a popular thing that is in place in the radio all the time, but you're doing something a little different that has a deeper background and a stronger connection to the heritage, I think that definitely brings people to, you know, to get more interested in the culture. And some other people feel that they can connect somehow with African heritage or Caribbean heritage. People are Puerto Rican and they've never seen that before, so they feel like they just found an identity that they didn't know about.
La música siempre es algo que llena el alma, no importa qué tipo de música sea, pero reconectar con mis raíces de nuevo, que las tenía hace años cuando estaba allá, pero es volver a aprender todo eso, es reconectar con las raíces de uno. Eso me mantiene en una sanidad completa y se olvida uno de los otros problemas que tendrá.
The fact that I'm in the US makes me want to go back to kind of like get that experience of bomba en plena in the island, because I didn't have it when I lived there. But at the same time, the fact that I'm here bringing bomba to the community here, makes me feel more, connected, that I'm doing something right for not only for the local community, but something for my culture.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elena Martinez, and thank you all for attending today's program. I want to thank Melinda, Rosa, and Jose, and all the staff at Centro for organizing this discussion. And to everyone, may the 4th be with you. But for today's program, we're going to see, as part of the program, 3 videos and interviews conducted through Centro about 3 different types of musical genres as practiced by Puerto Rican musicians. These interviews and the videos, they contain overarching themes of roots, raíces, as connected to one's identity and culture. And we'll use the stories that we see in these videos today as jumping off points to talk about the various musical forms that make up the totality of the Puerto Rican musical experience, or the Puerto Rican experience. But not, as when we talk about the Puerto Rican musical experience, not all the forms that we'll be seeing today are actually what we consider traditional Puerto Rican forms of music. Young people today listen to hip hop and have a big influence on hip hop, for instance. And Raquel Zivireta has written a lot about that, how Puerto Ricans were involved from the beginning of that genre. Puerto Ricans of a certain generation love and can sing every song to mariachi music from the Mexican movies of the 40s and 50s, because many of them grew up going to all the different theaters and seeing all the Mexican films from the Mexican cinema. So music like Mexican mariachi music, the tangos of Carlos Gardel, the flamenco of Lola Flores are all part of our experience and our soundscape, because that's what the music that was part of where we lived, where people went to see music and theater. So that'll be part of the discussion today. And the first one that we just looked at, we're going to start with our look at our musical roots from Puerto Rico with Semilla Cultural. Semilla Cultural performs bomba, the most African of all the Puerto Rican folk and traditional forms, which also include the forms such as plena, la música jíbara, danza. The roots of bomba go back to the Haitian Revolution, when people fleeing Haiti settled in other parts of the Caribbean, and they brought with them this genre of music called baumba. In Puerto Rico, this mixed with elements from people from the Congo, and we see that Congo influence with the use of the kwa sticks, the sticks that are used usually against a little barrel in bomba. And Maria of Semilla Cultural talks about how this, and also there's a dialogue between the dancer and the drummer that she talks about. In bomba, the bomba dancer, makes movements that the drummer, who plays the primo or subidor, follows. And this is an example of call and response, which is seen in most type of music that have African roots, whether it's bomba or in the United States, such as jazz, gospel, or blues. So it's just this other way that connects us to our African roots. However, and also I just want to make, the group Semilla Cultural, they talk a lot about founding and performing in this group is a way for them to connect to their island and Puerto Rican heritage. However, on the island, while bomba was performed in the mid-20th century by performers like Rafael Cepeda, it really never caught on in the mainstream and popular music. Part of this was due to racism, and many didn't want to acknowledge the African roots in Puerto Rican culture. It was also due to the fact that the Spanish language popular music of the mid-20th century was dominated by the Afro-Cuban forms of music, such as mambo, cha-cha-cha, that whole complex. And so many Puerto Ricans became part of that scene, performing it, dancing to it, listening to it. But it was Cortijo, the musician, the drummer Cortijo, who was the first to adapt the rhythms of bomba at a time when bomba, as I mentioned, was only played in places where there were Black communities on the island, like places like Loíza Aldea. But Cortijo became inspired to sort of start incorporating bomba into his music. He was part of a band, and remember all the Latin bands at that time in the mid-1950s, they played Cuban rhythms. But he became inspired to start incorporating his own music, Puerto Rican music, once when he was playing at a hotel in San Juan with the Cuban vocalist Miguelito Valdez. And Miguelito Valdez says to Cortijo, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, all you Puerto Ricans play Cuban music so well, but I'm curious, why don't you play your own rhythms? So Cortijo was inspired by this, and he adapted some bomba forms to the music of the dance band that he was in. He used the rhythm of sika, and incorporated that into his arrangements. And his arrangements of traditional bomba songs in the dance band format made him a hit with islanders and expanded the audience of the music. Songs like Maquino Landera, El Bobón de Elena are examples of this. Interestingly enough, Cortijo didn't use the traditional bariles de bomba, the bomba drums that you saw in the video that Semilla Cultural was using when he performed. He adapted the bomba rhythms to the battery of Afro-Cuban percussion that was used in the dance ensembles of the time, conga, bongo, and timbales. But these adaptations became the norm when other dance orchestras began imitating Cortijo and performing and incorporating some of these other elements. And then later on in the 20th century, in the 1980s and 90s, then we get this other new development when groups like Los Pioneros de la 21 in New York City, in the Bronx, they make Puerto Rican roots music very popular, leading to a renaissance of Puerto Rican traditional forms, including bomba, along with plena, within the Puerto Rican diaspora communities, leading the way for young Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Rican communities in general here to know their own music. I think it's really important. The musician Bobby Sanabria, many of you know, not only is my partner, we co-direct the Bronx Music Heritage Center. He grew up in the Melrose section of the Bronx and talked about at that time, a young Puerto Rican just walked to the parks, walking to the streets. All the sounds that you'd hear from the parks, from the rooftops when you heard drums, were the Cuban sounds of rhythms like guaguancó played on conga drums. But a few years ago, we went to Orchard Beach and we saw and heard people playing barril de bomba. So it was a complete sea change. Now, you would have never seen that a generation ago, but now sort of bomba music has become part of the diaspora communities as well as on the island as well. And bomba flourishes throughout the diaspora in New York City, in Chicago, New Jersey, the Bay Area, and San Francisco, Texas. And then from this video, you see also Virginia as well. So now we're going to go see another form of music. And in our second video, we will see the Puerto Rican musician Eggy Castrillo, who works in salsa, jazz, and Latin jazz. And he's also an educator at the Berklee College of Music.
Bueno, ya desde muy pequeño, ya yo estaba dando señales de que me inclinaba más por la percusión, más que por otro instrumento. Aunque tengo que decir que mi primer instrumento en mi casa, como a los 4 o 5 años, fue un pequeño órgano que me regalaron. Pero no duró mucho ese idilio con ese instrumento, porque me llamaba más la atención la percusión. Después me fui desarrollando, empecé a oír más percusionistas, a oír los nombres de Mongo Santamaría, de Tito Puente, de un montón de gente, y empecé a interesarme más hasta que entro a formar parte de la Escuela Libre de Música de Atorrey, Ramos Antonini, y ahí empiezo a relacionarme con otros muchachos que tenían las mismas inquietudes que tenía yo en ese momento, que era la música, y ahí empecé a oír más de los otros músicos y de los percusionistas, y a oír más de su música, a estudiarla mejor, y eso fue lo que me quedé con eso para el resto de la vida. Primero viví por 6 meses en la ciudad de Nueva York, pero eso estaba muy difícil ahí. Y salí corriendo de ahí y me mudé a un pueblo al norte de Cuba. se llamaba Miami. Miami, Florida. En esa área de South Florida estuve viviendo por 6 años. Ahí tengo la suerte y la dicha de conocer e irme de gira con el señor Arturo Sandoval, que es un afamado trompetista cubano. Con él tuve la suerte de darle la vuelta al mundo 4 veces y tocar con otro montón de gente mientras estaba con él. Gente que se trepaban a tocar, que grabábamos juntos con Michael Brecker, Michel Camilo, Tito Puente, que es mi ídolo y mi mentor. Con el señor Sandoval tuve muchas gratas experiencias y pude conocer el mundo. Yo fui a dar 2 conciertos, uno con el señor Víctor Mendoza, vibrafonista mexicano, que era maestro aquí es maestro aquí en Berkeley, ahora está en Berkeley, Valencia, y el señor Ed Uribe, que también era maestro aquí. Ellos me recomendaron con el chairman de percusión de aquí de Berkeley, vino a verme y me dio el trabajo. Así que de Florida, entonces me mudo a Boston, donde ya llevo dando clases en esta institución aquí en Berklee College of Music casi 16 años. Soy el único, por el momento, el único maestro puertorriqueño dando clases aquí y espero que no sea el único por mucho más tiempo. Es importante estudiar las raíces de la música que tú decidas estudiar. En mi caso, la música latinoamericana, porque esto es un lenguaje. Yo no sé si tú has oído nunca el decir que el lenguaje de la música. Bueno, la música es un lenguaje y tú tienes que aprender ese lenguaje. Es como si tú quieres expresarte en ruso y hablar con un ruso, tú tienes que hablar ruso, tienes que estudiar ese idioma. Lo mismo pasa con la música. Si tú quieres tocar música afrocubana, tienes que estudiar música afrocubana y aprender el lenguaje de la música afrocubana. Si quieres estudiar música de la India, tienes que estudiar y aprender el lenguaje de la música de la India. Entonces, ¿qué pasa? Cuando tú te vas a las raíces y estudias con seriedad las raíces de la música que tú quieres estudiar, entonces eso te va a dar a ti el lenguaje para destacarte y para poder desarrollarte más. Porque si no, vas a llegar hasta un punto y de ahí no vas a pasar. Entonces es importante ir para atrás. Yendo para atrás en la música, las raíces, de quiénes fueron los que empezaron, de dónde salió, todo ese tipo de información. Entonces que tú empiezas a entender qué es lo que se está haciendo ahora y para dónde va a ir la música. La forma que yo doy mis clases, como te dije, yo hablo mucho de historia de la música. Aquí a mis estudiantes yo les hablo y les pongo videos y oímos música en CD desde los comienzos de todo este movimiento música caribeña. Más fuerte, la influencia más fuerte es la de Cuba. Pero también tenemos la música jíbara puertorriqueña, la bomba, la plena, tenemos de la República Dominicana, el merengue, el palo. Hay un montón de otras vertientes, de Venezuela, de Colombia, de Panamá. Y entonces, como yo tuve la suerte de estar con muchos de estos íconos, Puente, Sandoval, Paquito de Rivera, Chucho Valdés, toda esta gente que me decían cosas, Rey Barreto, Mongo, que tuve el privilegio de conocerlos a todos ellos y sentarme como estamos hablando tú y yo ahora, a darme toda esa información, pues ahora yo a mis estudiantes les paso toda esa información que ellos me dieron a mí. Yo los pongo a bailar. Yo pongo ahí plena, tabal, y arranca todo el mundo aquí a bailar y los pongo a tocar los tambores de plena, los panderos de plena. Así que ellos tienen todo el concepto. Tan pronto tú entras por esa puerta para adentro, esta es la embajada de Puerto Rico aquí. Vamos a empezar por ahí. Esta es la embajada. Pero tan pronto tú entras por esa puerta para adentro, ya estás en el Caribe. Así haya un blizzard afuera con 45 pulgadas de nieve. Aquí adentro lo que hay es tremendo bailoteo y mucha salsa y de todo. Así que esa es la forma que a mí me gusta enseñar. De todo. O sea, como más completo de todo, tratando de cubrir todos los espacios. Hasta ahí.
Hi, everyone. So I hope you enjoyed the interview with Eggy Castillo. And we do have a couple questions, which I'll get to in a couple minutes after we talk about some of the other videos. But just to Eggy's video, he teaches at the Berklee College of Music. And when he talks about how he works with his students, he talks about whatever form of music one performs and learns about, there's a need to get to and understand the roots of the music. He discusses the need to understand the cultural context as well. If he is teaching plena, he makes the students learn how to dance plena. This also reinforces the connection between music and dance, as we see in forms such as bomba, as well as salsa, and in the different forms that are practiced, popular forms of music. Eggy also considers each musical form a language that one must become well-versed in. He himself performs in various styles of music, including jazz and Latin jazz, but he talks about one in this video that everyone associates Puerto Ricans with, which is salsa. And actually, salsa is a name for a group of Afro-Cuban rhythms, such as mambo, son montuno, guaguancó, guaracha, and others. And I guess, we're back talking about Cuban music again. Whenever we're talking about, talk about Puerto Rican music and musicians, we have to talk, I guess, about Cuban music as well, but I guess that's okay, right? De un pájaro las dos alas, the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico. But, the Afro-Cuban music that became so popular, and it was in 1930 when Don Aspiazu's Havana Casino Orchestra performed The Peanut Vendor in New York City. And Cuban music then became all the rage throughout the 20th century. And then in 1943, Machito and his Afro-Cubans record Tanga, which was considered like the first, song that really merged the jazz with big band jazz with Afro-Cuban rhythms. And later this music coalesced into what we call mambo, and later what we call salsa. And really, as the Puerto Rican community in New York City really took to this music and made it its own. Many of the best dancers, and of course, many of the greatest musicians were Puerto Ricans. Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, Ray Barreto, Charlie and Eddie Palmieri, Manuel Kendo, Jerry and Andy Gonzalez, Eddie Montalvo, Hector Lavoe, Willie Colon, El Gran Combo on the island, and then the list just goes on and on. But I think this shows that Puerto Ricans are very adaptable as musicians. And why is this? With these other forms of music, whether it be hip hop, whether it be salsa, we're very adaptable. And maybe this comes from sort of like living and between worlds, which maybe is a manifestation of colonialism. The poet Tato Laviera talks about being ni de aquí ni de allá, from neither here nor there. And I bring this up because recently I was interviewing a Puerto Rican author about being bicultural. And we talked about my favorite anthropological term, which is liminality. Liminality is often referred to as being betwixt and between, or like the line from Tato's poem, neither here nor there. Liminality usually refers to a time or space during a rite of passage when one is transitioning from one stage of life to another, but it is also a place where one is open to multiple influences, where cultural change can occur, and where there's a continual process of movement and exchange. And a space, this explains to me, a space where Puerto Ricans have been open to multiple influences is the case of music. and a place where Puerto Ricans have become very fluent in these musical languages, and in particular, salsa, in the case of salsa, which has become central to the Puerto Rican experience, even though it's the foundational music is from somewhere else, but it's become, central to our experience. And Puerto Ricans have left their mark on salsa as well, not only playing Afro-Cuban rhythms, but incorporating adding Puerto Rican musical elements. In the mid 20th century, 40s and 50s and 60s, you had the band Cesar Concepcion's band, and he adapted plena to a big band format. So he incorporated plena with, mambo rhythms as well. But really the most famous to do this was the musician Willie Colon. Crazy politics aside, and we hope a full recovery from his recent car accident, Willie Colon is the greatest proponent of doing this with the music. He has made salsa style albums using Puerto Rican traditional music. With Mon Rivera, he made an album of plenas called There Goes the Neighborhood in 1975. He used a similar concept with the Asalto Navideño recordings that he made with Hector Lavoe and Yomo Toro, where he incorporated what we call Christmas music, which is la música jíbara, Christmas music into salsa arrangements. Some of the songs on that album are all like traditional Puerto Rican. Canto a Borinquen is a traditional Puerto Rican aguinaldo Christmas song. Others, Esta Navidad, Aires de Navidad, sometimes they go from a Cuban guaracha into an aguinaldo, or an aguinaldo back into a Puerto Rican aguinaldo back into a Cuban son montuno. So he sort of like mixes up the music. But the Afro-Cuban genres are still there as the underlying foundation of the songs, but he brought in the Puerto Rican elements. And this was so important to that generation growing up when the Asalto Navideño albums came out, and on the Fania label, because again, a lot of young Puerto Ricans maybe had just heard this music at Christmas time. It was their parents' music, grandparents' music, didn't think it was cool to listen to. But Willie Colon and Hector Lavoe made this Puerto Rican style of music hip to listen to. It wasn't just our parents' music anymore. So with doing straight ahead Afro-Cuban music or adding Puerto Rican components, Puerto Ricans have been very innovative in the salsa music. Now, for the final video we're going to see is an interview with the Puerto Rican jazz musician Miguel Zinon, talking about the release of his 2014 recording, Identities Are Changeable.
La manera que yo escribí las composiciones de este proyecto estaban todas basadas en esta idea de identidad, ¿no? Ya sea este primer tema o los otros temas. Y yo lo que traté de hacer fue tratar de buscar algo que fuera una traducción musical de esta idea de lo que es la identidad, ¿no? Y las identidades que pueden ser múltiples, que pueden cambiar, que pueden haber varias identidades dentro del mismo individuo y que esas identidades pueden tomar diferentes espacios de protagonismo en diferentes puntos de nuestra vida, dependiendo de nuestra experiencia y de las cosas a las que estamos expuestos, etcétera, etcétera. Y desde el punto musical, yo hice esto básicamente con ritmo, desde un punto de vista rítmico. A lo que me refiero es que todas las composiciones, incluyendo esta composición de Donde Vienes y todas las composiciones del disco, tienen varios caracteres rítmicos, varias identidades rítmicas, ¿no? Que coexisten en un espacio, en el mismo espacio. Este primer tema, el primer track del CD y de la composición, tiene también varios propósitos. El propósito principal era usarlo como un tipo de presentación para la persona que iba a estar escuchando o viendo el show, ¿no? Cuando nosotros hacemos el show, pues generalmente tiene también un video con unidad multimedia, que es donde se ven las personas que están siendo entrevistadas, se ven los subtítulos de lo que se está diciendo. Hay un tipo de también montaje de video que hizo un artista amigo nuestro. Pero la idea de ese primer tema, de Dónde Vienes, es presentarle al público todas las personas quienes ellos van a estar escuchando durante el resto del disco, ¿no? De la presentación. Y bueno, cada uno pues se presentan, dicen cuál es su nombre, dónde nacieron y de dónde son sus padres, ¿no? Porque todos ellos son nacidos en Estados Unidos, en Nueva York o alrededor de Nueva York, pero sus padres son de Puerto Rico. En algunos casos, en muchos casos ambos padres, en otros casos uno de los padres y otro de los padres porque nació en otro lado. Y en ese caso pues se van presentando varios niveles de identidad, ¿no? Cómo ellos se relacionan con el lugar donde nacieron y se criaron y cómo se relacionan con el lugar donde nacieron sus padres. Y más o menos una introducción a lo que a la idea de lo que es el proyecto, que en verdad es la idea del proyecto es tratar de meterse más dentro de la pregunta, una pregunta general como la pregunta que es el centro del proyecto, ¿no? ¿Qué significa para ellos ser un puertorriqueño, ¿no? Y en este caso, pues, este primer track como que se empieza a meter dentro de los diferentes caminos que se pueden encontrar para llegar a la respuesta, si es que hay una respuesta. Y metiéndonos ya dentro de este track, el segundo track que se llama Identities Are Changeable, como el disco. Yo, cuando fui al proyecto, obviamente entré con una pregunta específica en la cabeza, pero saliendo del proyecto no te podría decir que esa pregunta tuvo una respuesta, ¿no? Porque una de las cosas que me di cuenta es que las experiencias y la percepción de lo que significa para estas personas ser New Yorker o ser puertorriqueño o tener una identidad específica, ¿no? Cambiaba mucho de persona a persona e inclusive dentro de una misma persona en diferentes puntos de su vida también cambiaba. O sea que no es algo a lo que podamos apuntar de una manera precisa y decir esto es lo que es, por lo menos desde el punto de vista mío y desde lo que saqué de estas entrevistas, sino que es algo que está evolucionando constantemente, ¿no? Esta definición de lo que es nuestra identidad nacional o de lo que es el puertorriqueño, etcétera, etcétera, y nos podríamos meter mucho en el tema del puertorriqueño nacido en Puerto Rico versus el puertorriqueño nacido en Estados Unidos, en otros lugares, y qué de verdad lo hace diferente, qué los hace iguales, qué hace a uno ser más puertorriqueño que otro, o si lo hace ser más puertorriqueño que otro, si es algo que de verdad deberíamos diferenciar o no, o simplemente son dos, ¿cómo se dice? Dos puntos de vista de la misma cosa. La idea de este proyecto es organizar conciertos de jazz gratuitos en las áreas rurales de Puerto Rico, con el propósito obviamente de expandir el público en Puerto Rico para este tipo de música, expandir el público del jazz, que en Puerto Rico básicamente se concentra casi exclusivamente en el área metropolitana, en el área de la capital, ¿no? En el área urbana y no en las áreas rurales. Y también utilizar el jazz en este caso como un tipo de semilla, ¿no? Para alimentar la idea de que la actividad cultural en general, ¿no? Es algo que es bien importante para la sociedad y algo que es indispensable y debe estar disponible para todo el mundo, ¿no? Y yo pienso que en el caso de muchos de nuestros países no se le da quizás la relevancia y la importancia que debería tener la actividad cultural o este tipo de exposición a actividades culturales nuevas. Mi experiencia viviendo acá en Estados Unidos y cómo estar fuera de Puerto Rico, ¿no? Ver Puerto Rico desde una perspectiva desde afuera, lo que me ha pasado es que me he conectado mucho más con la isla de cuando estaba viviendo ahí, ¿no? He visto las cosas desde afuera y como que me he reencontrado con mi identidad como puertorriqueño, ¿no? Ya sea con la música, con la cultura, con la tradición, la historia, etcétera, etcétera. Me he, hasta cierto punto, centrado toda mi atención en tratar de descubrir cómo la esencia de lo que es para mí ser puertorriqueño, ya sea mediante la música, mediante mi crianza en la isla, etcétera, etcétera, cómo eso se puede traducir en lo que soy yo como músico, como artista, como persona.
Hi, everyone. We just saw Miguel Zinon talk about jazz, another genre that's not a Puerto Rican style of music, but which Puerto Ricans have a long history with. And you may not know this, that Puerto Ricans have a long history with jazz if you watched Ken Burns' 14-hour History of Jazz documentary. But Puerto Ricans have been involved with this music from the beginning of the 20th century. This goes back to World War I and the 18 Puerto Ricans who were part of the 369th Regimental Band led by James Reese Europe. This is the band that is credited with introducing French audiences to the style of music. It wasn't really coalesced as jazz per se, but it was sort of a proto-jazz, had ragtime and blues with sort of hints of jazz interpretation. But you know, the Puerto Ricans were 1/3 of that regimental band that came out of Harlem. And the most famous of the musicians who were part of this band was Rafael Hernandez. And after World War I, Rafael stayed on in New York City. And like many of his other compatriots in the group, in the regimental band, they stayed on and played with musicians in the burgeoning, the African-American musicians who were part of the burgeoning jazz scene there during the Harlem Renaissance. Rafael Hernandez himself played with the pianist Lucky Roberts. So there's other early Puerto Rican jazz pioneers as well. In the mid-1930s, Augusto Cohen had the first Puerto Rican-led big band in New York City. It was still a Latin music band, but utilized some jazz arranging techniques. Then, of course, one of the most famous jazz songs of all time, a jazz standard, is Caravan, which was written by Juan Tisol, a Puerto Rican who played valve trombone in Duke Ellington's band. And everyone knows Tito Puente as a mambo king, yet he was an established jazz musician and composer. His main influence had been the jazz drummer Gene Krupa, and all his music was influenced by jazz harmonies and arranging techniques. So he was more than just mambo. He was just an incredibly innovative musician. You can listen to his albums, Puente Goes Jazz or the song Bohemian After Dark, and get a sense of his work in jazz. And today there are still many Puerto Rican musicians performing in jazz and also bringing their own, again, as I talked about in salsa, in jazz, bringing in their cultural influences. You have Pedro Guzman, the virtuoso cuatro player, who has a group called Jibaro Jazz. New Yorkers Bobby Sanabria and Papo Vasquez have been incorporating bomba into many songs on their albums. So you know, they're really integrated into the jazz scene as well. And actually, maybe one of the questions, I think, just to refer to one of the questions that has come up, Anna Vasquez Howard has talked about, is there still a controversy about Latin jazz as a genre? And I would say, just to, since we're on this topic, to answer this question now, Dr. Chris Washburn just came out with a book about Latin jazz. And the main theme of that book is about how Latino musicians have been left out of the canon of jazz, and they've been part of it, whether they're Puerto Rican, whether they're Cuban, they've been part of it since the early days, but have never really given that acknowledgement. And Latin jazz is always seen sort of like the stepbrother, stepsister of jazz itself. So so that is still something that is still an issue today. You know, a lot of times, you know, Latin jazz is just sort of considered its own thing and not really, you know, seen as proper jazz music, and you know, in mainstream jazz. So so that is still something I would check out. I would check out, as I mentioned, Chris Washburn's book on that topic that just came out on that. But to go back, we'll get back to some of the other questions, but to talk about Miguel's work, in his albums, identities are interchangeable. He's asking, what does it mean to be Puerto Rican in the 21st century? And he's using jazz to explore these themes of one's roots and identity. With Miguel, he talks about how he has various levels of identity: American, Puerto Rican, New Yorker. I think he even calls himself a New Yorican, which I would have to disagree with his definition of a New Yorican. Far be it from me to tell someone how to identify themselves, but being a New Yorican for me is being someone who grows up, spends their formative years in the diaspora, straddling Puerto Rican and US cultural forms. That includes, listening to the music of both places, eating the foods of both places, speaking, or maybe not speaking properly, the language, the urban experience, different things like that. So that identity, I'm not, might not agree with him totally on that, but it is part, of course, being New Rican is part of the Puerto Rican experience, the complete Puerto Rican experience. Again, and there is the question though of why are Puerto Ricans, we are very interested in these themes of identity. Is it precisely because of the colonial legacy? Not only Miguel Zinón, but other musicians are looking into this issue as well. A few years ago, Residente, one of the members of Calle 13, the reggaeton group, he made an album where he made songs from all the different countries. He got his DNA tested, figured out where he was from, all the different that he had, genetically was related to, and traveled to those countries and worked with musicians and made music from that. So again, many Puerto Rican musicians are exploring these themes with music. And again, is it a legacy of colonialism? Zinón mentions that living outside, in that interview, he mentions that living outside the island has connected him more to his island roots. And is that because here, think about it, in New York City, we have Coquito Masters every year. Debbie Quinones in East Harlem created this program, the series of who makes the best Coquito, to prove who makes the best in New York City. It's a very look forward to program. The last few years has also become a competition of making pasteles. Do they have these on the island? But maybe it's not necessary because you don't have to prove your Puerto Ricanness there, but we do that here. We have to prove that our identity and our roots to ourselves here. But anyway, so with that takeaway from Miguel's CD, we've seen how these three forms of music, bomba, salsa, and jazz, though not all traditional Puerto Rican forms, are central to the Puerto Rican experience. So with that, I'm going to go to some of the questions. There was one question that came in through the chat. Let's see if I can get that. Sorry. This question, I saw it earlier. Okay, from Martha Ellen Davis, the great scholar. She talked about, what about the other side of the traditional music? We talked about today plena and bomba, mentioned plena and bomba. She's talking about seis, aguinaldo, improvised decima, and a couple other forms, like El Rosario Cantado. And we did talk a little bit about that, how there were musicians who were also incorporating that too, like Willie Colon with the great, of course, those albums Asalto Navideño, and then there are groups doing, say, using the cuatro in different forms of music as well. So there are Puerto Rican musicians who are also sort of playing around and using those other forms in different genres of music. And let me see other questions. Okay, let's go to the Q&A. So one person asked, are all members of the Bomba Plena group Puerto Rican? If you're talking about Semilla Cultural, the band that was shown in the first video, I don't know if all of them were Puerto Rican. I assume so from what they were talking about, how they were talking about their heritage. But there's a lot of groups, there's Bomba Plena groups here that, not only here, I know of ones in the Bay Area too. There's a great, Denise Solis is leads a female bomba band in the Bay Area, and she's actually Mexican American, and she leads that in San Francisco. Here in New York City, a lot of the big bands, like the famous ones like Los Planeros, Bombazo, have people who are maybe white, African American. There's a great band led by Matthew Gonzalez, who grew up sort of in the Rincon Criollo Casita, learning this music when he was a little kid. He's in a group called Quinto Zono, and there's Mexican Americans and white Americans. So the music tends to be very open and flexible, and people, people like it. It's great to see that, right? We know that every culture loved mambo music and was dancing to mambo music, whether you were Italian, Jewish, African American, Cuban, Puerto Rican in the 1950s. But today we're seeing, everyone enjoying Puerto Rican traditional music as well. Another question from Angel Roman, the concept of liminality, twilight doorways. Would code switching going from Spanish to English qualify? Also, politics aside, Cheche Cole brought in African themes. Yeah, I think, I think living that like bicultural, to me, liminality is sort of part of that as well. It's this bicultural, this bicultural definition of who we are. We take in, and especially I think in the diaspora, especially in the diaspora, I think as a New Rican, you grow up, all the Puerto Ricans who, grew up in the 50s and stuff, they were listening to doo-wop music, they were listening to funk. I mean, that's sort of how Boogaloo sort of formed, right? This mix of like American art forms, all these young Puerto Ricans listening to Black American art forms and sort of incorporating that with the Cuban music that they were listening to of that time. So it is, code switching as a language too, and New Yorkers go back and forth with that as well. And I think, one of the, this idea of code switching in language or in sort of in the work that you do, I think like, Miguel Algarín, the poet who just passed away in December, the New Rican, Puerto Rican poet, he sort of came up with the term New Rican, but the spelling of it that we all use today with the NU. He, to me, is sort of like that complete biculturalness as a New Rican. He was a great scholar of Shakespearean. He was a Shakespearean academic with many accolades for his work in that. Yet he also was part of the streets of Lower East Side and could talk like that, and his poetry was like that. And so he, he brings all those worlds into who he is. And to me, that's like a New Rican, and that sort of code switching and being able to live in both worlds. And then you mentioned Cheche Cole, again, a Willie Colon song. Willie Colon is just so, like I said, it's just politics now have gotten crazy, but in terms of what he did musically in that era when he performed with Ruben Blades and Hector Lavoe, I mean, it was really incredible. The music that he brought in, and he was really young. I mean, he started in those bands when he was like 16, in the late 60s, started performing with those musicians, and he was just very innovative and just so much creative things, bringing in Puerto Rican themes, African themes. It's so innovative, and I think, just a great proponent of the music and what you can do, when you're open to these other influences, right? In that liminal space, when you're open to the other influences. And, oh my God, there's a really long question here. Let's see. Okay, okay, there's a couple long questions. Let me see. Edwin Torres, as a poet, I respond to the between spaces identity. As a New Rican poet, I respond to the between spaces other. If Puerto Rican music is a collaged hybrid, a reference to the diaspora, is there a common vision across the culture that can be identified as Puerto Rican? I'm wondering if there's a language for the memory of an island, a sort of utopia of the musical mind that is constantly changing. I'm wondering if there's an emotional opening where musicians mark their art. Is there a language for the memory of the island? And you're saying, is there a common vision across the culture that can be identified as Puerto Rican, whether it's for people who want to grow up on the island or grew up in the diaspora? In one sense, there's sort of this this idea of this sort of like cultural memory, and maybe like as the Chicanos use Azatlan as sort of this thing to represent the sort of culture that we dream of. Maybe Borinquen is sort of that, and we use that. And but I think also, though, I don't think I would want to be shoehorned into that as well, because there's Puerto Ricans who don't speak a word of Spanish, right? So are they less Puerto Rican? Are they less Puerto Rican than those who grew up on the island knowing Spanish, right? So I think the experience is very open, and the Puerto Rican experience should be very open and broad, and what it is. Yeah, I don't know, but I think there is sort of this sort of like cultural vision, this cultural memory, and I think like this idea of Borinquen, I think of that when a lot of times when I think of like how again, as I mentioned, how Azatlan is used for the Chicanos, and is there and maybe some of us strive towards that, and I think people in their artwork and in artwork with Taino imagery, with the music, with poetry, can bring all sorts of these elements together. There's one question from Orlando Hernandez. Hi, Orlando. Can you say something about the Nueva Trova music and its impact on Puerto Rican music? People like Roy Brown and others. What's really interesting, I think, too, is that I was thinking of Nueva Trova, too, as a, Nueva Trova sort of comes out of Latin America and South America. It has this music of resistance. And I think in terms of that, you know, that some of the music might have, I'm not a musician, so I can't talk musically. There probably can be people who can talk musically. If there's something musically that might relate it to something in La Música Jíbara, some of the Nueva Trova, if there's any musical similarities, I can't speak to that because I'm not a musician. But in terms of music of resistance, right? Music Nueva Trova is music of resistance and, you know, very political themes in the songs. In the music of Puerto Rico, you know, Plena sort of emerged as a music of resistance. And in one sense, right? In one sense, you have people could write songs about whatever was happening. It's called, you know, everyone knows Plena as the sung newspaper, because people who maybe couldn't read or write used this to use Plena to get stories across, about what was going on at the time. The woman named Elena was stabbed in the neighborhood or something, right? Elena. But there was also, some of the Plenas had very political themes to it, had very political themes about, you know, making fun of political figures, the bishop, or, you know, the American imperialism. So I think that strain of resistance runs through it. And now you hear what's going on in Puerto Rico ever since the last few years with the problems with the politics of the island and Hurricane Maria. A lot of groups there are really using their voices to say a lot of things politically about the music. I know bomba has sometimes been called a music of resistance. Personally, I'm of the thing that, like, I'm two ways about that. I wouldn't call it resistance music in the same way that maybe Nueva Trova is, or maybe a Ruben Blades song is a music of resistance with a political theme. You can maybe say that anytime people lift up their voice and get a chance to have a platform for their voice, that's resistance, right? Because you're getting your voice out. But, you know, would flamenco or blues be resistance music? I don't think so. I think it's people, it's laments, it's people giving voice to tragedy and bad things. And it's a great thing to give voice, but it's not inherent, it's not something explicitly political, which Nueva Trova is, which some Plena songs are, which the songs of, like, as I mentioned, Ruben Blades or you know, Eddie Palmieri and Justicia, right, that are really explicitly political. So I think there are strains of the music that have really explicitly political strains to it, and Nueva Trova is sort of part of that as well. Let's see a couple sometimes call and response, you know, African forms of music, whatever the African forms of music are from. Someone asked, what about call and response? African forms of music, you know, you can listen to jazz and see the instruments, you know, answer to each other, you know, in solos, the same way a bomba dancer with the drum, well, the drummer and the dancer will interact with each other. In Cuban rumba, another African-based music, the drummer and the dancer interact with each other. So that's sort of, you know, just part of the DNA of anything, you know, African-based music. Okay, a couple other questions here, and then there's a really long one which I'll go back to. But what influence does this music today have what influences does this music have now in popular reggaeton and trap music of today? Again, I'm not a musician, so I really can't talk specifically about musical influences. But what's really interesting, there was a radio show on a few years ago, in Puerto Rico, and they would bring on musicians, like reggaeton musicians, on with like traditional musicians. And on one of the shows, they had Victoria Sanabria, who comes from a family who does, you know, La Música Jíbara on the island, and they paired her to do like a controversia with Ivy Queen, the reggaeton singer. And they were going, like, battling out improvised verses, verse for verse. Now, improvised verses are part of, as someone mentioned earlier, are part of La Música Jíbara, the music of, say, it's the decima, which comes from Spain. You know, this 10-line verse form is in Puerto Rico, and throughout Latin America, but in Puerto Rico, the improvisational aspect of it is really important. And Victoria Sanabria and Ivy Queen went back and forth, trading improvised verses. People yell out a theme or something, and you go back and forth and see if you can best each other in, you know, in the satirical way you present the theme, you know, or how creative you are. So you know, some of those, you know, some of that I guess holds over, right? That's also Hector Lavoe also could improvise music when he was as a salsa musician. That's what made him so great, right? People go see him sing, and he would improvise in verses. So that's sort of some of that influence. So it might not be a genre in itself, but sort of some of the elements like call and response or the improvisational nature sometimes or you still see in the different forms of music. Yes, Aurora Flores mentioned bomba drumming and drums were outlawed in Puerto Rico as they realized the correlation between the rate of uprisings on the farm and the drumming. Owning or playing a drum was a crime. This is resistance music. Yes, as I mentioned, I think you can use some of these times, having a platform to do something creates resistance music. Is the music inherently, the lyrics or anything inherently resistance? I'm not sure if people have, know the lyrics of early bomba. If it is, maybe I'm wrong, but the music is not itself implicitly, but people can use it for political work. And like I said, whether you're using it to just to get your voice out there, it is many times in itself is a political act. But in this terms, yes, if you're using it, to when it was outlawed, that in turn becomes, again, you're doing it even though you're not allowed to. So you're that in terms, that is a way of resistance as well. Someone asked about the Puerto Rican danza. So the Puerto Rican danza is a form of music that has also European roots as part of is one of our sort of the music that comes from our European roots, from Puerto Rico. And I don't know. I don't really know if anyone is incorporating that into any popular music today. You can still see it performed. There's groups like Danza Fiesta who incorporate danza, so you can see what danza looks like in their performances, in their programs. I don't know if there's anyone using danza in any popular forms of music today, salsa or jazz or anything like that. Okay, let me see. There was one other question. Okay, no, that wasn't really a question. That was just a comment. So I think that was all our questions. Let me just check the chat if there's any questions in the chat. Oh wait, why? Oh, someone actually just mentioned, Dima Sanchez mentioned, danza is being used in jazz by Angel David Matos. So there are people incorporating danza as well. So that's great. And I think actually jazz is becoming, where I work in the Bronx, Bobby and I run a space called the Bronx Music Heritage Center. And we have a series called Nuevas Voces, Emerging Voices in Latin Jazz, because jazz has become, we're working with Latin American musicians, but I mean, you could look at this all over the world, musicians from, the Czech Republic, musicians from, Italy, all over, Armenia, are using jazz as a platform to take their traditional music and put it into jazz arrangements, because jazz, I guess, it provides a flexibility, and that musicians can incorporate their own forms of music. So I think jazz is a very important platform for traditional forms of music, because you can incorporate the rhythms, music of from wherever your homeland is. And people are doing that throughout Latin America as they are throughout the world. So I think jazz is a really important vehicle for that today. So I'm just trying to think, there's a lot of comments here. You guys should all read, there's some amazing people here who are making comments. So who know about the music, who are talking about, so they're not really questions, but I would go in and read the chat and see what some of the folks are saying. Someone asked about what is the name of the book about Puerto Ricans and jazz. Someone had put later in the chat, Basilio Serrano's book. Basilio Serrano wrote a book about pioneers in jazz, but also women during the jazz age also. Women performers, women musicians and vocalists who performed during the jazz age. Some of them were involved integrated more with jazz, more with popular music, but both those books are available by Basilio Serrano. And I think that's all the questions I see. Unless, I don't know if Melinda or anyone sees anything that I'm missing from anyone. Let me just see one more for the Q&A. I think that's it. Everyone, I want to just thank you for joining us today for the Central webinar, our afternoon webinar. And it was great seeing a lot of, I know a lot of folks were out there watching it that I know. Thank you for joining, and thank you for Centro for making this program happen.
Thank you so much, Elena. We really appreciate your insights and comments. And we'd like to thank everybody for watching, and also our Centro staff. If you'd like to see more of these videos, be sure to register for the Puerto Rican Heritage Cultural Ambassador Program. The link can be found in the chat section. Our next event is May 12th at 6 p.m. Meet the authors of the new media in Puerto Rico, journalism in colonial settings and in times of crisis. Thank you for watching. Hasta la próxima.